Welcome, everyone, to our Bible class this morning. Appreciate you being here. We're going to pick up this morning. Sounds really loud, but maybe it's just me. We're going to pick up this morning discussing Does God Exist in our Foundations for Faith study, which we started last Sunday. And if you have not picked up a book, there's still quite a few in the back on the table. It's this book, Is It Reasonable to Believe in God? There's also a list of our planned classes back there. I wanted to point out one thing on here. You probably all noticed, I just noticed yesterday, that the dates I put on here are Saturdays, so we're not meeting on Saturdays. Just shift them by one day and you'll be good. But today we're going to talk about Does God Exist? And I think it's obvious, but I'll also mention it, that the lessons that are referenced on the sheet are the lessons in this book. And I'll also highlight to you, if you haven't picked that up already, that we're not going to cover them in order that they are in the book. We're going to be jumping around with a different structure. And this morning, in that regard, we're going to be jumping to really cover topics that are talked about in Lesson 3 in this book. To some extent, we'll do that this morning. But I do want to begin where we left off last week with talking about the idea of truth. So we'll do that in just a minute, and then get into our first part one, if you will, of a question, does God exist? And looking at the evidence for that. Let's begin with a prayer. If you would, please bow with me. Father, we're humbled before you, and we thank you for this time we have to come together to study together about you and your power that we see throughout the world around us. We're so thankful that you've seen fit to provide us with all the things that we need for life. And more importantly, Father, to provide us an opportunity to call you our Father, to be your children, to be brothers and sisters with one another. Help us to encourage one another and to shine as lights in the world that we can lead others to glorify you. Be with us throughout our studies this morning and with the other classes here as well. Be with the teachers in all the classes and the children as they learn from your word and learn about you to grow in love and understanding. Be with us throughout our worship and help us to do things in a way that are pleasing to you and bring glory to you and that build up each other. We're most thankful for Christ and his sacrifice, the plan that you put in place before time began to save us, to restore our fellowship with you and give us hope of spending eternity with you. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. All right, so where we finish, or want to go back and quickly review. Some of you were not here last week, but also just to remind us the things we talked about last week in a synopsis standpoint. Throughout this quarter, really want you to keep this verse in mind. We talked about it quite a bit last week, but 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15 says, "But in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect." We talked about the fact that we need to be ready, is what's commanded here, for anyone that asks us to give a defense. And we talked about that's the word that we often talk about, apologia. Apologetics comes from that idea. It's a legal defense term, which means you should be able to speak like a lawyer about the evidence of why do you believe the things that you believe, is the command that's given here. So that's what we're going to be working on together throughout this quarter, is how do we strengthen our understanding of our faith? What is it built upon? We talked about these objectives, and I'll just remind you quickly, to strengthen our faith, let's focus on ourselves and not be thinking about how do we correct everyone else in the world. Let's think about how do we build our faith, increase our readiness to defend our faith, we mentioned. And the four topics, if you want to think of it that way, that we're really going to look at evidences in connection with throughout this quarter is the idea of truth. Does truth exist? God, Jesus, and the Bible. And we'll hit all of those as we go through our lessons. Mentioned this, focus on ourselves. These are, and I mentioned this last week, very big topics, right? I mean, these are the core questions that we all have, that everyone has. Where did I come from? Where am I going? Why am I here? Those are the types of things we're talking about. So challenge yourself to think about these things. Sometimes we can just say, well, I've thought about that in the past. I got it all figured out. But let's share those with one another and have discussions about it. be open and share. Also mentioned, and I would encourage you again and keep in mind, if you have resources that you found helpful in these types of studies, please share those, and we can share them with the group as well as we go forward. Quick reminder, we looked at the passages in Hebrews that talk about the idea that faith is the foundation of our hope. And then we talked some about the idea that really the foundation for faith is truth. And we know from John 17:17 and other passages in the New Testament that God's word is truth. And Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. So Jesus is truth personified. He's truth incarnate. And we'll talk more about that as we go forward. But just wanted to remind you of this sort of foundational stack, if you will, of hope built on faith, which is built on truth. So what is truth? We were talking about this at the end of class last week. And of course, this question's asked in the New Testament. Pilate asked Jesus, what is truth? So I want to begin with some truths about truth. And I'll give you the opportunity. Can you think of any, and it's sort of a way of asking what's the definition, but can you think of any truths about truth? Yes, Leo. Okay, unchanging, doesn't change over time. Other thoughts, Mark? Okay, so the truth is the truth, whether you believe it or not, and we'll talk about that. Anything else, Chris? Okay, so it can be factual that you can see from the evidence that you have yourself. Yes, Allison? Can be proven, okay, with evidence. Okay, yeah, so proven with evidence. There's something that supports the idea that truth is true. I'll say it that way. Any others? You've hit many of the ones that I wanted to point out. So let's look at this list. This was kind of mentioned, but truth is discovered, not invented. No one's creating truth. Truth is truth. As was mentioned, it's not changing. And therefore, if you think about all of the search for truth, it's looking for something that already exists. It's not invented. We're not creating new truth. It's transcultural. Truth doesn't change based on people, place, time, etc. It's permanent. Unchanging. Belief changes. Mark mentioned this. Belief can change, but truth doesn't. Think about it. At one point in time, I think a majority of the people on the world, on the earth, thought that the earth was flat. They thought that was true. That was their belief. That wasn't the truth. The truth was wrong. So their belief could change to believing that the world is round, but the truth was still the same. It never changed. And beliefs don't change the truth no matter how sincere. Mention that because this is an argument that you'll often get into when you're having discussions with people. And we, I think, can fall into this trap as well, is we'll discount someone speaking truth because we don't like them or because they're talking about it in a way that's not conducive to our viewing them as a positive person. But truth is truth. And that was actually the last one, unaffected by the proclaimer's attitude. Doesn't matter how it's being taught, truth is truth. And no matter how strong our beliefs are about something, Mark kind of mentioned this as well, it doesn't change the truth. We can have a different depth of belief, but it doesn't change the truth. So keep those concepts in mind as we go forward. So if you kind of summarize this idea, I think contrary beliefs are possible. You can have different beliefs, and we see that all the time. And beliefs can change, but contrary truths are not. So we can believe everything is true if we want to, and we talked a little bit about that last week, but we can't make everything true. So keep those thoughts in mind. We talked about this as well at the end of last class, but why do people believe what they believe? And I'm just going to go ahead and show this for the sake of time to move us forward. But I think most of the reasons, if not all the reasons you could come up with, you can bucket into one of these categories. So there's sociological reasons, psychological, religious, or philosophical. And if you kind of work from left to right, think about what is the basis for actual truth. Allison mentioned to have a truth, you need to have some evidence that supports it. You need to have an argument that supports it. And really, none of these categories outside of the philosophical reasons provide evidence of truth. And we can understand that. Think about sociologically. We may have friends, or even our family or society can believe something, beliefs change, but not necessarily everyone is going to believe things that are true. And we see that all the time. The psychological reasons, different people have different opinions about what makes them feel certain ways. So they can't be contradicting truths. There's either, so it's not a reliable source of truth. Religious reasons, and we'll get into this, that Scripture actually makes the argument, and we'll look at this in later classes, to be the Word of God. So it comes from truth. And we'll talk about that, so it can be a basis for truth. But these other are people as well that can create thoughts themselves, but may or may not be tied to truth. So if you think about how do you determine what's actually true, and we apply this in our lives all the time without really thinking about it. We see it perhaps most clearly in trials where someone, the question is it true that this person committed this crime? How do we do that? All the evidence is gathered, and it's argued, and it's talked about, and you come up with, well, what is the most coherent, consistent, science, evidence-based result of all the information that's been shared about the question that's being asked? And that's the approach that we need to take for any question about truth. And really, that's the basis of science as well, is this: what's the best explanation for all the evidence that you have? That's the scientific method in a very simple statement. So, justification for truth. In the classic sense of philosophy, arguments are needed to support truth. Not philosophy that every man, comes up with his own ideas about what's the proper way to think, but in the idea of philosophy built upon first principles, if you will. So you can find the truth through logic, what's rational arguments, and we'll talk about that briefly. Evidence, we talked about that you need to gather all the evidence you can gather when you have a question. And then science. And science, again, is just a way of best explaining all the data that we have. And this is the approach that we're going to take throughout this quarter to hopefully strengthen the foundations of our faith. So let's think about this question. How are truths about God known? And I put the about God parenthetically because it's the same way that how are truths known in general. But how would you answer this question? Thoughts? What can you share? How will we know truths about God? Okay, it's by seeing His creation, because that's evidence, right? Yeah, seeing His creation. Okay, He's revealed His Word to us, and we'll talk about that for sure. What else? What do we do with seeing His creation? Marvel, for sure. But yeah, definitely we marvel. Think about it this way. We take that information, that evidence that we have, along with first principles, things that we just know to be true. And you build arguments about whatever question you're trying to answer. So again, this can be true for any truth or about God. We draw a conclusion from observations. We look at the world around us, we build up all that evidence, and we draw a conclusion. And then we put that together into an argument, we'll call it, where we line up premises and make a valid conclusion. So let me give you a simple example. Here's a logical argument, right? All books have at least one author. How do we know that? Because they were written. Because every book we've ever known, someone has written what's in that book. Perhaps now it's written by artificial intelligence, but someone created that. But all books have at least one author. That's a premise that's based on inductive investigation. We gather all the data, all the evidence that we have, and it says every book that we've ever known of that has ever been done has at least an author. Our class book is a book. How do we know that? By definition, right? It's an inductive observation. We know what a book is. A book is defined to be something like this that has pages and words, information, therefore this is a book. So we can logically make an argument that says if all books have an author and this is a book, then this book has an author. That's a conclusion by deduction. So we've taken evidence, we've created a premise, we took different information, created another premise, put the premises together in an argument, and came up with a logical conclusion. That's the way that we think if we're thinking properly about every question that we try to answer. Of course, we don't think of it that as each one of those steps, but that's what we should be going through. So let's think about the question, does God exist? And take that same approach that we just talked about. And Eddie already mentioned, how do we do that? And this week and next week, we're going to talk about 4 arguments. There are many arguments, obviously. There's many books that have been written. There are many that can be made directly from the Scriptures that God exists. But we're going to look at 4, just because I think they cover a wide range of the many arguments and are some of the strongest ones that we can look at. 3 of them we'll talk about this morning as we go forward, and some of them were talked about in our Lesson 3 in our book. So if you've read that, you'll see some information there. We're not going to get into everything that's in Lesson 3 in the book because it gets also into talking about biblical evidence, which we'll cover later. But the information about arguments for God existing that are extra-biblical, we'll cover some of those this morning. So the 3 that we'll cover today, first one is called the cosmological argument, and it's an argument from the beginning of the universe, and we'll talk about that idea. And then there's 2 that are kind of grouped together in what's called teleological arguments that are really just arguments based on design. And we'll talk about design of the universe and then design of life as 2 different arguments that have really been put together primarily, I'd say, over the last 50 years. Or updated is probably a better way to say it, based on scientific information that's been gathered in the last 50 years. But teleological arguments. We'll stop there this week because that's a lot of information to cover. But then next week we'll start with an argument from the idea that there's a moral law, the idea of morality. That's where we'll kick off next class. But keep in mind that they're all arguments that support the idea that God exists. So let's start with the first one, cosmological, based upon the beginning of the universe. And here's that same structure that we laid out for figuring out, this book has an author applying to the question, does God exist? And using the beginning of the universe as a basis for the argument. And this is the way it's been written out, incidentally, for about the last 1,000 years. You'll see this referenced some places as the column argument because it actually was developed most fully, almost in these identical words, by a Muslim in around 1000 to 1100 AD. But of course, it goes back to the very beginning of time, actually. But the first premise is that everything that had a beginning had a cause. And the second is that the universe had a beginning. Therefore, the universe had a cause. So this is the same structure that we talked about in our other argument. So in order to check this, we need to check the premises, right? Are the premises true? Does everything that had a beginning have a cause? And did the universe have a beginning? So we'll talk about those, and then if those are true, then the argument holds based upon logic. So first, everything that had a beginning had a cause. What do you think about that? Does that sound right to you? Chris? I'm saying anything that begins was caused.
You know what I'm saying? Like, has a purpose, that's why.
Not a purpose, no. It was something caused it to appear. Yeah. Not from a good clarification. So this is actually a first principle law that's well accepted, the law of causality. And it's actually the fundamental principle of science, right? If you think about any experiment that we do, anything that we investigate is based on the idea that whatever we observe has a cause. So we're going to observe something, and then we're going to back up to try to figure out what caused that to happen. So one example was, none of us sitting here are probably too concerned that we're going to get home and there's going to be a horse standing in the middle of our living room. Because it's just not going to appear out of nowhere. If we did see that, we would think, well, how did this horse get here? We don't think, well, it just appeared out of nowhere and it's in my living room. We would think, well, some horse got loose and it happened to walk into our house. And we start thinking about what are all the causes that led this to happen. We do that in everything without thinking about it. Again, this one, incidentally, was unquestionable and unchallenged really until about the last 50 to 100 years. This was just taken as a given. There's actually a critic, a guy named Hume, back in the 1700s, and he was a critic of everything, basically. He tried to point out flaws in anything that was a logical argument, particularly in religious matters. But he even made the statement back in the 1700s, I never asserted so absurd a proposition as that something could arise without a cause. So it's kind of, I can make all of these critical statements, but that's inarguable. You can't argue that there's something that can arise without a cause. So I'm going to take that to say this premise is true. Now it's interesting, and I'll throw this in just as information. Over the last 50 years or so, because premise 2, which we're going to look at, has become very difficult to argue to not be true, some of the atheistic world have started arguing that this is not true, because they find it easier to argue that this is not true than to argue that the universe didn't have a beginning. But that's an aside. Don't get sidetracked too much by that. So premise 1 is true. So number 2, the universe had a beginning. This was really questioned until the early 1900s. And the most common accepted belief, if you go back, way back to Aristotle and others, and even up through the Middle Ages, was that the universe is eternal. So think about what that's saying. People just assumed that the universe had always been. That was what was commonly thought, really up until about the last 100 years. But now, the result of scientific study, again, independent from anything that relies on what the Bible has to say, has proven, and we'll look at this, to a level of reasonable scientific proof that the universe had a beginning. And some of that, again, was mentioned in your book. And I want us to look at this acronym SURGE and talk about some of the arguments here of the universe having a beginning. And I will, again, mention this book, because I mentioned this last week, but there's a book called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. If you're interested in more in-depth discussion on these topics, this is a good book to reference. And some of the information that I'll be sharing this morning comes from that particular book, including this idea of SURGE as an acronym for proof of a beginning. And this was mentioned in your lesson. Can anyone tell me in simple terms, what does the second law of thermodynamics have to do with the universe having a beginning? How's it described in your book? Page 23. Everything's running down, okay? Yeah, so second law of thermodynamics, that's a good way to describe it. Everything's running down. Think about 2 examples that I think help us wrap our mind around it. Think about your gas that runs your car, at least if you don't have an electric car, gas runs your car. And if you have a certain amount of gas in your tank and you're just driving, then the gas is going away. You're running out of energy. And what's going to happen when you drive long enough for all the gas to be gone? Stop. You're out of energy. You're out of an energy source. That's what the second law of thermodynamics says for the whole universe, for all of created matter. There is a limited amount of usable energy that is decreasing. Actually, the first part is the first law of thermodynamics, but it's decreasing over time. Another example, I think, that may even be easier for us to understand, or just a different way to think about it. Think about if you had a flashlight and you charged it and you set it out overnight. And the next morning it's been on all night. That flashlight's going to be, to some extent, a little bit dimmer than it was before. Well, it will be, because its energy is running down. It has a finite amount of energy stored in it, and it's running down, and it's going to run out. So second law of thermodynamics says energy is decreasing. Usable energy is decreasing throughout the universe, which says that there had to be a starting point, or there would not be any remaining energy. Our tank would be empty if it was an infinite amount of time going back. And that connects with the first law of thermodynamics that's mentioned in the book that says there's a conservation of energy. So there's a finite amount, is basically the way to think about that. That there's a certain amount of energy that was put into the universe, into your gas tank, into your light, into your flashlight, and that amount of energy was set. There's not new energy being created. It's running down over time. Second one I want to mention is the idea that the universe is expanding. And this is very interesting to think about. And just a historical aside, Albert Einstein, of course, came up with the theory of relativity back in the early 1900s. And when he first came up with his theory of relativity, he was under the assumption that the universe is eternal and it's therefore going to be in a steady state. So when he came up with his equations, it wasn't looking that way. And he was so tied to that idea as a core concept that he built in what we would call a fudge factor. He built in a constant that he just made up to try to make it appear like the universe was in steady state. But it just goes to show how the scientific idea was really based upon a broader worldview. But then in the 1920s, Hubble, that we know from the Hubble telescope, was actually able to look out into space and see that the universe is expanding through a telescope. And we can do that much more accurately today with the improved telescopes that have happened in the last 100 years. But there's no question today by any reputable scientist that the universe is expanding. And in fact, they can also tell that the farther you go out from the expansion of the universe, it's expanding at a faster rate. So things that are farther away are moving faster than things that are close to us. They can see that. And if you reverse that process, so think about everything's expanding outward and expanding at an increasing rate. If you watch a video of the history of the universe in reverse, then it's going to get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, back to a point in time when there's no space, there's no time, there's no matter. So how did you go? How did the universe go? How did nothing become something? That's what's described as the Big Bang. And that term was actually thrown out by Professor Hoyle 100 years ago, and it just stuck. He said, well, if you went from nothing to having space, time, and matter, there must have been a Big Bang that created this energy that we talked about already. And that's where the Big Bang comes from. Keep in mind, all of those things came into existence at that creation point. Not just matter, but time, space, and matter. And it's difficult for us to wrap our minds around that. There was no time prior to that creation point, prior to a first cause starting time. And we'll talk more about that, but that's an important thing to think about. It came into existence at that time. Any questions about that one? There's a lot you could go into, but hopefully that makes the point. Okay, let's go on to the next point. And this is interesting. So they started, once the scientists were able to see that the universe is expanding, it looks like it's going outward, it's increasing in expansion rate the farther out you go. Well, if this amount of energy was created at the Big Bang, then we should be able to see some evidence from that, was what scientists began to say. And so they started looking for evidence. And in 1965, actually, there were a couple of scientists in New Jersey, Bell Labs in New Jersey, that started recording background radiation energy by accident. And they thought, well, something's wrong with our equipment. And they started investigating. But they found out, no, there was nothing wrong with the equipment. It was actually there. And what they'd actually discovered was the afterglow, the heat and the light energy. Actually, we can now only see the heat because of the time, but the heat energy that still exists as an afterglow from that creation of time, space, and matter at the beginning in a Big Bang. So they can see the energy, see the heat energy from that Big Bang taking place. And scientists can do this, and it's been repeated much more in depth over time, that heat can still be detected today. And you think about, if you set off an explosion, you're going to feel the heat, right, and see the light. The light's going to go away quicker, but you're still going to feel the heat. This level of explosion, we still feel the heat today. We can still sense it. Scientists can still sense it. Incidentally, this led a man by the name of Robert Jastrow, who actually is now sitting in the chair that Hubble sat in at the observatory, and also is one of the leaders of the Goddard Space Flight Institute. But he wrote, "No explanation other than the Big Bang has been found for the fireball radiation." That's this background radiation. "The clincher, which has convinced almost the last doubting Thomas, is that the radiation discovered by these two guys has exactly the pattern of wavelengths expected for the light and heat produced in a great explosion. Supporters of the steady state theory have tried desperately to find an alternative explanation, but they failed. At the present time, the Big Bang theory has no competitors." And this is by an atheist, and he makes some other statements we'll talk about later, but basically saying we can see the result of this explosion that took place in the past. A related one is what's been defined as great galaxy seeds. Another thing that scientists believed was that if this explosion occurred of energy at the beginning during creation, then we should be able to see temperature variations in this radiation. And won't go into details on this, but basically there was going to have to be temperature ripples, if you want to use that term, to enable things to come together to form galaxies and to form planets. It would be required based upon the scientific evidence that they could look at. And that has now been found. And actually, NASA, $200 million project in the late 1980s, project leader by the name of George Smoot announced findings in 1992 that characterized these energy ripples, these temperature variations. And George Smoot's comment says, "If you're religious, it's like looking at God," these things that they're able to observe. And it says the ripples are so exact, Smoot commented, that they're down to 1 part in 100,000 is how exact these measurements are. And the same person called them, quote, "the machining marks from the creation of the universe and the fingerprints of the Maker." So here you have scientists, just based upon the evidence they're looking at, saying something created what we're seeing. Incidentally, a couple of more facts. These seeds, as they're called, are the largest structures ever detected. And the largest one is actually 1/3 the width of the known universe. 30 billion light years is this one seed. So, great galaxy seeds. And then finally, and I mentioned this already, but Einstein's theory of general relativity. This theory now has been verified in scientific communities, so they say 5 decimal places. And in simple terms, this theory demands a beginning, an absolute beginning for time, space, and matter all at the same time. So the basis really of all of our physics and astronomy is built upon the theory of general relativity that requires this idea of space, matter, and time starting together and remaining together. You can't have one without the others. It's a simple way to think about Einstein's theory. So that's the surge scientific arguments that support the idea that the universe had a beginning. So, take premise 1 that says everything that exists has a cause, or everything that has a beginning has a cause. The universe has a beginning, therefore the universe has a cause. This is another quote from Robert Jastrow that I mentioned earlier. He's an astronomer, founder of the NASA's Goddard Institute. He says that there are what I or anyone would call supernatural forces at work is now, I think, a scientifically proven fact. And it's interesting, this guy's an agnostic. But he makes statements like this throughout his writings that talk about the evidence points towards something supernatural. He's not willing to say that supernatural connects to God, to a deistic idea, but he's saying something supernatural had to happen. We can't have anything, or that's what the evidence points toward. And it's interesting that he uses this language. It's a scientifically proven fact that there are supernatural forces. Jordan.
In God, and they don't want to admit, or they want to construct whatever explanations they can, or explain away the phenomenon of the universe in such a way that doesn't lead to a God. This attitude still says, we know so much about the origins of the universe that there couldn't possibly be another explanation except the supernatural. So, like, on the one hand, we're all sitting here thinking, we have no idea except what God has revealed to us.
Right.
And we take it on faith.
Yeah.
Maybe it's aliens, maybe it's a simulation.
Right.
We have
all kinds of ideas.
We don't know. But these scientists are like, we know so much that even though we don't know, it could only possibly be this one or
something supernatural. Yeah. And it's interesting, and that really goes into the idea that science is a faith, right? And these people have a faith that says their faith is in science or in matter, and that shapes their view of any conclusions that are drawn. But it's a good point. Let's move on from the cosmological argument, because I want to get through these. And there's one question that comes up. You say, well, okay, so we'll accept that the universe had a beginning, therefore it had a cause. Who made God? Is that a conflicting question with this idea? Or what do you think about that? How would you answer that question if somebody asked you who made God? What?
I would start with the premise that if before the universe was here, God was here, he exists outside of time.
Okay.
Therefore, his eternal being is something that we can't comprehend. But in order for this stuff to be made, he would have to have already existed. And I don't know exactly how you would say, like, answer the question who made God, but this logic kind of leads you down the road.
Okay. Yeah, so keep in mind the premise that we talked about, and it was stated very specifically in this way. Everything that comes to be needs a cause. God's never come to be. God's eternal. So God doesn't need a cause, even from the premise as stated. God never came to be. He's eternal. Tom?
If I was, and I have been in discussions with people who are like of the persuasion that God doesn't exist, and when we wade into these very deep subjects, one of the observations that I make is that something has to be eternal. It's either matter or it's God.
Right.
Well, the evidence is so overwhelming that matter has a beginning. And so you've eliminated that.
What's more reasonable, yeah.
So the only other conclusion is there has to be a being that is eternal.
Right.
Because something has to be eternal.
Right. And that's a great point. And that, incidentally, that's an argument that oftentimes is made and is missed by atheistic arguments about the beginning, wanting to come up with all sorts of creative theories about what was there when there was nothing. And to Tom's point, something has to be eternal, because nothing can't come from nothing. So something is eternal. Is it God or is it matter? God is much more reasonable. So let me ask you this. So something, this is kind of what Tom was talking about. Something has to be eternal. Go back to what we see around us, the evidence that we see. What does that something need to be like? What are some characteristics that something should have? Has to be smart. Okay. Okay. So outside of time, space, and matter, because those things didn't exist. Unimaginably powerful. Has to be smart. Has to create from nothing. Supremely intelligent. We'll get into that. Design the universe with incredible precision. And one that may not be as obvious, but I think if you think about it, it becomes obvious. It had to be personal or choice-making. The first cause chose to create everything that exists. So the first cause made time, space, and material universe. Incidentally, notice these are characteristics that the God of the Bible lines up with, but this is not based on anything in the Bible. This is based on looking at evidence in the world around us. Let's look at one more in the last few minutes here, and then we'll pick up there next week. But the precision of the universe, same logic or same argument structure we talked about earlier. Every design had a designer. The universe has a complex design. Therefore, the universe had a designer. And I'll go through these a little quicker because similar to the previous one we looked at. But every design had a designer. This is the classic watchmaker argument, right? If you see a watch laying on the ground, don't think that it just naturally came to be in that state. If you're walking through the forest and saw a Rolex, you didn't think, well, look at what nature created. That doesn't happen. So the idea that if something is designed, it has a designer, that's a given. Premise one is true. The universe has a highly complex design. This was already mentioned that we should be awestruck in thinking about the universe, and sometimes I think we just take it for granted. But there's this idea of the anthropic principle. Everything has to be designed in a way that can support life, and scientists more and more are amazed by what that complexity requires. So the universe is precisely designed to support human life. You have these anthropic constants that have to be exactly what they are, or life can't be sustained. So there's these interdependent conditions that have to be true. So let's think about some of those. The first one's gravity, and we're all familiar with that, but how precise does gravity have to be for life to exist? This is the latest explanation that was given, is if you had a tape measure that you could stretch across the universe, and you change the setting of gravity by 1 inch on that tape measure, life would not exist. Now, think about that. I mean, that is, it's difficult to wrap our heads around, but that's the probability. A second one, we kind of mentioned this one earlier, it's called the cosmological constant, and it's this energy density, measure how much energy there is. If there's a slight change in one direction, stars and planets couldn't form. If there's a slight change in the other direction, the universe would collapse. And all scientists agree with that idea. How precise? This is actually written by Dr. Robert Collins, that's written a lot on these sorts of things. He said the precision of the cosmological constant is so precise that if you were out in space and going to throw a dart to the Earth, you would have to hit a bullseye the size of an atom. That's the probability of this constant being set as specifically as it needs to be set. So if you put these two together, what's the odds of supporting life? 1 in 100 million, trillion, 6 trillions. I don't know what that number is. It's big. And that's just 2 of them. There are at least 30. Most people say there's more than 100, but there's at least 30 anthropic constants. And some of them are obvious to us. Oxygen level. Change it a little bit, we can't live. Atmospheric transparency, carbon dioxide, speed of light, water vapor in the atmosphere. Location of Jupiter, which, by the way, protects us from meteors that would destroy us otherwise. Thickness of the Earth's crust, the Earth's rotational speed, the Earth's tilt. If it was a little bit different, a couple of degrees different than what it is, we wouldn't be able to survive because there would be extremes in weather. Seismic activity, lightning rate, all of those things, many, many, many more, are anthropic constants. So these premises are true. And here's a quote from this Dr. Robin Collins, who's professor of math, physics, and philosophy. Only recently have we discovered how precise every condition had to be in so many areas for us to have this universe that allows life. The deeper we dig, we see that God is more subtle and more ingenious and more creative than we ever thought possible. Now, this shows some of that scientific arrogance I think that Jordan was talking about. God's really more than we expected, is kind of the quote here. But if you look at the precision that's required for life, that's the scientific conclusion. Any question, Mike?
With the 6 trillion thing, I heard somebody express it in a way that those odds are like you winning the lottery every day for 10,000 years.
Okay, yeah, very infinitesimally impossible. All right, we'll stop there and pick up actually with the design of life in the next class. Thank you all.